A packed courtroom, a man's fate hanging by a thread. Everyone believed he was guilty until his most loyal partner walked through the doors when the Can-9 German Shepherd saw his police officer again. No one could hold back their tears. What happened next was something no one could have ever imagined. Before we dive into this heart-wrenching story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Now get ready for a reunion that will touch your heart like never before. Detective James Carter sat at the defendant's table, his hands clenched together as if trying to hold himself together. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like an iron cage. He had spent 15 years serving the city, taking down criminals, risking his life. Yet today he wasn't a hero. Today he was the accused. The courtroom was packed. Reporters scribbled notes. The prosecution's witnesses had painted him as a disgraced officer, a man who had abused his power during a high-stakes drug raid. The media had latched on to the story, turning him into a corrupt cop. Overnight, James's attorney, Mark Reynolds, leaned toward him. "Just stay calm, we have one last shot." James let out a slow breath. He knew what Reynolds meant. The only other witness who was there that night. Reynolds stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call Officer Max to the stand." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge, a serious-looking man with silver hair, lifted an eyebrow. "You're calling a dog?" The prosecutor, Eric Sullivan, smirked. "A K9, are we seriously allowing this?" Reynolds stood firm. "Max isn't just a dog. He's a fully trained police officer, a K9 who was at the scene that night. If we're here for the truth, then let's hear from the only other officer who was there." The judge exhaled slowly. "Very well. Bring in the K9." A moment later, the heavy wooden door swung open at the back of the courtroom. A K9 handler, LED, Max, a powerful German Shepherd. Into the room, his black and tan coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights and his ears were perked up. Alert, his sharp brown eyes scanned the room. And then he saw James. A stunned silence fell over the room. Max froze his gaze, locking onto his former handler for a split second. The highly trained K9 hesitated. Then, as if breaking all protocol, he lunged forward. The handler wasn't prepared. The leash slipped from his grasp as Max sprinted across the courtroom. The sound of his nails tapping against the polished floor echoed in the silence. James barely had time to react before Max leapt onto him, his large paws pressing against his chest. A soft whimper escaped the dog's throat, a sound no one had ever heard from the fearless K9. His tail wagged furiously, his head nuzzling into James's shoulder. Gasps filled the courtroom. Jurors exchanged glances, some of them swallowing hard, blinking back tears. Even the judge, a man known for his cold demeanor, adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat. James exhaled shakily, running a hand through Max's fur. "I missed you too, buddy. For the first time since this nightmare began." He felt like maybe justice would finally be served, but no one was prepared for what would happen next, because Max wasn't just here for a reunion, he was here to reveal the truth. The entire courtroom remained frozen. No one dared to breathe. Detective James Carter had spent his life in intense situations, facing down criminals and life-or-death decisions. But this moment with Max, clinging to him in the middle of a courtroom, was something he never expected. Max refused to move, his large paws pressed firmly against James's chest, his tail wagging furiously and his ears perked up as if waiting for his next command. His eyes, those sharp brown eyes filled with intelligence, locked onto James with undeniable loyalty. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Control your dog, officer." But before the Can-9 handler could react, Max did something that sent chills down everyone's spine. He turned his head, locked eyes with Eric Sullivan, the prosecutor, and let out a low, rumbling growl. The tension in the room shifted instantly. The jurors exchanged glances. The murmur started again. But now they weren't whispers of doubt toward James. There was something else entirely. James's attorney, Mark Reynolds, seized the moment, Your Honor. I believe Max has something to say. Sullivan scoffed, rolling his eyes. This is ridiculous. He's just a dog. Reynolds took a slow step forward. Just a dog. This dog has spent years in the field, saving lives, detecting danger, and reading people's intentions better than any of us ever could. And right now he motioned toward Max, who was still locked on to Sullivan, his lips slightly curled. He's making it very clear that something isn't right. Max looked, lowered his head, staring Sullivan down, and let out another deep, warning growl. For the first time, the cocky prosecutor looked uneasy. The judge narrowed his eyes. Does this canine's behavior suggest something we should be concerned about? Reynolds nodded. Max was at the scene that night. He knows who was involved, and more importantly, he knows who he can and cannot trust. A suffocating silence settled over the courtroom. James slowly ran his fingers through Max's fur, his voice calm but filled with certainty. Max never growls without a reason. And just like that, the jury was no longer just watching a trial. They were watching a truth unravel before their eyes, but no one was prepared for what happened next because Max wasn't done. Revealing the truth, the courtroom felt electric, charged with an intensity that made even the most seasoned officials shift uncomfortably in their seats. Max's deep, guttural growl rumbled through the air, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on to prosecutor Eric Sullivan like a predator, cornering its prey. James Carter gently placed a hand on Max's back. Easy, buddy. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded. He had trained this dog for years, and he knew one thing for certain. Max never reacted like this, unless there was real danger. Sullivan forced a chuckle, though his face had lost some of its arrogance. Are you seriously trying to argue that this dog, this animal, is presenting evidence? What's next? Your Honor, will he take the stand and testify? But no one laughed. Reynolds, James's attorney, turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request permission for a demonstration. Max was at the crime scene that night. His behavior is more than just instinct. It's the result of rigorous police training. He reacts to guilt, to deception. And right now he's telling us something about Mr. Sullivan. The judge hesitated, glancing toward Sullivan, then at Max, whose ears were still pinned forward, his tail stiff like a flagpole. The air was thick with anticipation. Finally, the judge nodded. Proceed. Reynolds gestured to the bath. Remove Max's leash. A ripple of shock passed through the room. Even James widened his eyes. Are you sure? Reynolds nodded. Max knows the truth. Let'n see where he takes us. The bailiff hesitated before unclipping Max's leash. The German shepherd stood perfectly still for a moment, his nose twitching as if reading the very air around him. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he moved forward straight toward the prosecution's table. The room held its breath. Max's posture remained firm, his chest puffed out, his gaze locked on Sullivan, who was now gripping the edge of his desk. Enough of this circus. Sullivan snapped, his voice rising in agitation. This is a joke, a desperate attempt to distract from the facts. Then Max barked, loud, sharp, commanding a bark that demanded attention. Sullivan flinched. The jury leaned in. The judge tightened his grip on his gavel. Max took another step closer and let out another bark, even stronger than the first, his teeth bared, not aggressively, but with certainty. And then he sat down, right in front of Sullivan. Complete silence. Max's training was clear. He was a detection dog. He had been trained to sit when he found something or someone guilty. Sullivan's face turned, ghostly, pale. Reynolds, S.E. The moment, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you just witnessed what officers trust with their lives every day, a trained canine identifying deception. Max was at the scene that night. He saw everything. And now he's telling us exactly what we should have known all along. James felt a rush of emotions flood his chest, because at that moment, for the first time since his arrest, he wasn't the one on trial anymore. And everyone in that room knew it. But what would Sullivan do next? No one was ready for what happened next. The courtroom felt like it had been thrown into slow motion. Max sat firmly in front of Sullivan, his presence as commanding as any human witness. The jury members leaned forward, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity. James Carter, still seated at the defendant's table, felt his pulse race. Max had just done something that no argument, no piece of evidence, and no cross-examination had managed to do. He had shifted the entire weight of suspicion. The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Sullivan, do you have anything to say about this?" Sullivan forced a tight-lipped smile, but his hands were shaking as he reached for a glass of water. "Your Honor, this is absurd. We are allowing a dog, a mere animal, to dictate the direction of a legal trial. This is nothing more than theatrics." Reynolds stepped forward, eyes locked on the prosecutor. "You look nervous." "Mr. Sullivan, I am not nervous," he snapped. "I am irritated that we're wasting time." James watched carefully. He recognized this behavior, not from criminals he had arrested, but from witnesses who were hiding something. The jury wasn't looking at him anymore. They were staring at Sullivan. And then Max did something that shattered the last bit of control Sullivan had left. He lifted his paw and placed it on Sullivan's foot. A single gesture, a clear message. It was a signal, one that Max had been trained to do when detecting drugs, explosives, or a liar. The tension in the room exploded. One of the jurors let out a small gasp. Someone from the audience murmured, "Did you see that?" The judge leaned forward, intrigued. "Officer Reynolds, would you care to explain?" Reynolds kept his voice calm, controlled. "Max is a trained detection canine. When he sits in front of someone and places his paw on them, it means one thing. He has found what he was trained to seek." The words hung in the air. Sullivan's face flushed red, his grip on the table tightening. "This is nonsense. I will not." Bam! The sound of the judge's gavel slamming down echoed like a gunshot enough. The judge's voice was sharp. "Mr. Sullivan, please approach the bench." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. James felt his breath hitch as he realized this wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. Something much bigger was happening. Max had done more than just reunite with him. He had just exposed a secret no one saw coming, and what happened next would shake the entire case to its core. The judge's stern voice cut through the heavy silence. Mr. Sullivan approached the bench. Now Eric Sullivan's face had lost all its color. He hesitated, his hand gripping the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. The confident, arrogant prosecutor from earlier was gone. Max remained perfectly still, his paw resting on Sullivan's foot, his eyes locked onto him. James Carter watched heart-pounding. He had spent years reading criminals, and he knew the signs. Sullivan was guilty of something. Slowly the prosecutor stepped toward the judge's bench. His steps were hesitant, almost reluctant, like a man walking toward his own sentencing. The judge folded his hands together. "Mr. Sullivan, given the circumstances, I believe it is in the best interest of this court that we take a brief recess. However, before we proceed, I must ask, do you have anything you wish to disclose?" The room was dead silent. Sullivan let out a slow breath, rubbing his forehead. "Your Honor, before he could finish his sentence, Max let out a sharp bark, loud, commanding. The entire courtroom flinched. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Sullivan, is there something you'd like to say?" Beads of sweat formed on the prosecutor's brow. He reached for his water glass, but his hand was shaking too much to grip it properly. And then the door to the courtroom burst open. A uniformed officer rushed inside, heading straight toward the judge. He leaned in, whispering something urgent. The judge's expression hardened. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are taking a recess. Court will reconvene in 20 minutes. James's stomach twisted. Something was happening. Something. Big Max didn't move from his spot, his gaze never leaving Sullivan. James leaned toward Reynolds. What the hell is going on? Reynolds kept his eyes on Sullivan, a small smirk forming at the corner of his lips. I think we just hit a nerve. The tension in the air was thick as the judge stood, BFF escort. Mr. Sullivan, to my chambers. Sullivan's breathing became erratic. He turned as if preparing to leave, and then he ran. Gasps erupted across the courtroom as Sullivan made a break for the door, but he didn't get far because Max was faster. The German shepherd launched forward with lightning speed, slamming into Sullivan's legs, taking him down hard. A scream rang out as Sullivan hit the floor, his arms pinned beneath him, his body motionless under Max's grip. The room was chaos. Officers rushed in, handcuffing Sullivan, while the judge banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order, I will have order in my courtroom." James watched it all unfold completely. Stunned Max had just taken down the very man who had tried to destroy his life, and James knew this trial was over. But the real question was, what was Sullivan hiding? The courtroom was an absolute chaos. Gasps and whispers filled the air as Max pinned Eric, Sullivan to the ground, his sharp eyes burning. With unwavering focus, the prosecutor's body shook beneath the weight of the German shepherd, his breathing ragged, his entire demeanor shattered. James Carter remained frozen in place, his mind racing to process what had just happened. Sullivan ran. He tried to escape. That wasn't the behavior of a man who had been fighting for justice. That was the behavior of a man with something to hide. Max hadn't just taken him down, he had exposed the truth before a courtroom packed with jurors, reporters, and legal officials. Two uniformed officers rushed forward, grabbing Sullivan by the arms and yanking him up to his feet. The judge, his face red with anger, slammed his gavel against the bench. "Order. I demand order in this courtroom," but no one was listening. Sullivan struggled against the officers, his once polished suit now a mess, his tie hanging loose as if it were choking him. "Get this dog away from me," he snapped, but there was a tremble in his voice. Max let out one final growl, his fur bristling, before he backed off and returned to James's side, his tail held high. In triumph, the judge rubbed his temples, taking a deep breath. "Mr. Sullivan," he said slowly, "you just attempted to flee a legal proceeding in front of an entire courtroom. You better have a damn good reason." Sullivan said nothing. His lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Reynolds took a step forward, his voice steady and sharp. "Your Honor, I think we all know why Mr. Sullivan ran, because he's not interested in the truth. He's been covering it up this entire time." The jury members murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement. The judge exhaled his patience, wearing thin. "Mr. Sullivan, this is your last chance. Either explain yourself, or I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt." Sullivan's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. His gaze darted around the room as if searching for an escape. He licked his lips, then finally muttered, I didn't mean for it to happen. A cold silence spread through the room. James's breath hitched. Didn't mean for what to happen. Sullivan hesitated, then his entire body slumped in defeat the night of the drug raid. He began, his voice barely above a whisper. I was there. The room erupted. Gasps, shocked. Whispers. The sound of a gavel slamming repeatedly. James's chest tightened. He turned to Reynolds, who looked just as stunned as he felt. Sullivan had spent this entire trial painting him as the bad guy, as the disgraced officer who had supposedly used excessive force during a raid. But now he was admitting that he had been there quiet. The judge barked. He turned his sharp eyes toward Sullivan. "Explain yourself now." Sullivan licked his lips again. Clearly unraveling that night, he continued, his voice unsteady. "I wasn't supposed to be at the scene, but I was working with someone." The murmurs grew louder. James's fingers clenched into fists. "Working with who?" Sullivan squeezed his eyes shut, looking like a man walking toward his own execution. "The cartel," he whispered. The room exploded again. James's entire body tensed. The very cartel that he had risked his life to bring down, the same cartel that had nearly killed him. And Max had a man inside the system, and it was the prosecutor. The judge's face turned ashen. "Mr. Sullivan, do you understand what you're confessing to?" Sullivan nodded, his jaw trembling. "I was on their payroll," he admitted. I was supposed to make sure that no real evidence against them would ever make it to trial. When the raid happened that night, it wasn't supposed to. Someone tipped you off, Carter, and when you went in, I panicked." James's breath caught in his throat. That raid had been a disaster. From the start, he and Max had been sent in without backup, even though protocol dictated that a team should have been with them. It had always felt like a setup. Now he knew why. Sullivan gritted his teeth, his body shaking. "When I saw you take down their men, when I saw Max find the drugs that I was supposed to keep hidden, I knew it was over, so I spun the story before anyone else could. I made you look like the bad guy. It was the only way to protect myself." James's entire body trembled with fury. "You destroyed my career," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "You nearly got me locked away for life." Sullivan lowered his head. "I know." Reynolds turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe we have more than enough evidence to clear my client of all charges." The judge looked visibly disturbed, but nodded, agreed. He turned to the bailiff. "Take Mr. Sullivan into custody." The officers didn't hesitate. Sullivan barely resisted as they slapped handcuffs onto his wrists and began leading him out of the courtroom. But just as they reached the door, Max let out one final bark, loud, sharp, powerful. Sullivan flinched. James didn't look away. He wanted him to remember that sound, because that bark, the same one that had saved James in the field, that had warned him of danger, that had fought alongside him in life and death, situations, was the reason Sullivan had lost, and James had won. A deep breath left James's chest as the officers dragged Sullivan away. The weight on his shoulders, the months of stress, of fear, of fighting for his own name, was finally gone. Reynolds grinned. "Looks like Max just won your case." James chuckled, running a hand through Max's fur. The shepherd wagged his tail, his eyes bright with satisfaction. "He always does." The judge cleared his throat. "Detective Carter, as of this moment, all charges against you are dropped. You are free to go." The entire courtroom erupted in applause. James exhaled, his eyes stinging. He looked down at Max, who stared back at him with unwavering trust. Then, unable to help himself, he knelt down and wrapped his arms around his loyal, kind Max, let out a happy whimper, pressing his head into James's chest. After everything they had been through, after the betrayal, the lies, the near loss of everything they had won, not just because of the law, but because of loyalty. And James knew, no matter what came next, he and Max, criminal stripped of his badge, his reputation in ruins, but now, with Max by his side, he had cleared his name, exposed the real corruption, and proven what he had always known. Deep inside, loyalty never lies. The courtroom buzzed with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Jury members exchanged hushed words, and officers who had once doubted him now nodded in silent respect. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight that had crushed him for months finally lift. He turned to Max, who wagged his tail, his deep brown eyes full of quiet. "Victory, let's get out of here, buddy," James whispered, running a hand through Max's fur. Max let out a small huff, as if agreeing, but as James turned to leave, he found himself facing the judge once more. "Detective Carter," the older man said, his expression unreadable. "Before you go, there's one last matter to discuss." James's muscles tensed. He had expected to just walk out of that courthouse and never look back. But now he hesitated. The judge folded his hands together. "You were stripped of your badge when these accusations surfaced. but in light of recent events, I have been in direct contact with the department. He let the words sink in before continuing. The chief would like to meet with you immediately. James's heart skipped a beat. Everything had been taken from him, his career, his purpose, his identity, and now was there a chance to get it back? He exhaled sharply, looking down at Max, the German. Shepard had never doubted him, never once wavered. Through every moment of darkness, Max had fought beside him. Now maybe, just maybe, they could fight together again. An hour later, James found himself in his old precinct, a place he hadn't stepped foot in for months. Everything felt familiar, yet foreign. The same worn-out chairs in the lobby, the same coffee-stained desks, the same busy voices echoing through the halls. And yet he felt like a stranger until he heard someone call his name. Carter James turned to see Chief Raymond Porter, a man who had once been his mentor, his boss, and his biggest supporter, until the accusations had forced him to cut ties. The older man studied James for a long moment before his gaze dropped to Max. The shepherd stood tall and proud, his ears perked, as if he knew this moment was just as important as the trial. Then, in a move that stunned James, the chief extended his hand. James took it, gripping firmly. "You proved us wrong," Porter said simply. There was no grand apology, no unnecessary words, just the truth. James nodded. "I never doubted myself, and neither did Max." The chief glanced down at the German shepherd and let out a small chuckle. "Looks like your dog knew the truth before any of us did. He always does." There was a pause, a heavy one. Then Porter reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge. James's breath caught in his throat. He stared at it, the silver shield that had once meant everything to him, the one thing that had been ripped from him in disgrace. But Porter didn't just hand it to him, he placed it on the desk between them. "This isn't a gift." The chief said, "If you take this back, I expect the same relentless cop you were before, the one who never backs down, the one who fights for the truth, no matter the cost." James swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his sides. Then, without hesitation, he picked up the badge. Max let out a proud bark, his tail wagging furiously. Porter smirked. "Looks like you already have a partner ready to get back to work." James clipped the badge onto his belt, a feeling of rightness washing over him. We never stopped working. Chief, the next morning, James sat on his front porch, a fresh cup of coffee in one hand, and Max sitting faithfully at his feet. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the quiet street. For the first time in months, James felt at peace, but he knew one thing for sure. Peace never lasted long in his line of work. And he was right, because just as he lifted his coffee to take a sip, his phone rang. An old instinct kicked in. He answered without hesitation. "This is Carter, Detective Carter." It was Porter's voice, but this time it wasn't casual, it was serious. "We have a situation, we need you." James didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." As he stood, Max immediately perked up, ears forward, tail stiff with anticipation. He knew that tone. It meant one thing. Duty called. James smirked down at him. "What do you say, partner? One last mission." Max let out a sharp bark, standing up beside him, ready. James clipped his gun to his belt, patted Max's side, and walked toward his car. He had been knocked down, almost destroyed, but he and Max had proven the truth, and now they were back where they belonged, together, forever. What a journey! If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share it with someone who loves powerful stories of loyalty and justice. Do you believe in the bond between humans and their canine partners? Let